Welcome back to another episode of Living with FASD, an informational human interest show for those affected by prenatal alcohol exposure, their families and loved ones, and anyone else interested in learning more about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Brought to you by moi, Patti Kasper, your host and your FASD coach. And I am absolutely thrilled to be bringing back to the mic Dr. Susan Rich, a child psychiatrist on the East Coast of the States. She is very familiar with all things FASD. It has learning about it changed the direction of her life, just as it did for me. It kind of learning about it kind of changes everybody. And it's one of those areas that once you know it, you can't unlearn it. And I'd like to think that all the change is for the better, right? Susan, thank you for coming back on the show. Welcome, welcome, welcome to you. Good morning.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, Patty. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, so we've had a few conversations already, which were very popular with the audience. And so today you're back for a third, and I've been chomping at the bit to finally talk about your book, The Silent Epidemic, a child psychiatrist's journey beyond death row. So you have done some forensic work, interviewing people who got into the legal system, and ND-PAE, or neurodevelopmental disorder from prenatal exposure, alcohol exposure, is a part of the reason why they did the things they did, why they are where they are, should have been part of their defense. Not that any actions are excusable, but it certainly would have changed the what happens to them afterward, right? Making it more therapeutic and less punitive. And I still want to talk about that aspect of your book, which is fantastic. I highly recommend everybody get this. But today I want to focus on actually something in the very back of the book. It talks about social services, foster care, right? 70% of kids in care are affected by ND-PAE. That's a huge percentage. When you look at FASD, it's 5% of the population, but in foster care, because so many adverse childhood experiences are kind of, passed down generation to generation, and all kids in care have ACEs, right? Adverse childhood experiences. We just see so much more in foster care. And your question that you ask in the book is so poignant. Are we helping, or are we making matters worse? Tell us what you think.
Well, I want to go back to that statistic that you brought up about 70% of children in foster care being there
Mhm.
who have ND-PAE. I'm not aware of that statistic per se, so I'm not really sure. I know you worked in foster care, you
Mhm.
said for 24 years, so
Yeah.
you'd be more aware of that. I don't know that any large scale studies have been done. I think in my book, I went back to the Child Welfare League of America and I drew from data that they have about the numbers of children who are placed in foster care
Mhm.
because of alcohol and substance use problems from their
Mhm.
parents. And that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 to 95% of the children who are in
Mhm.
foster care
Yeah.
um, or child protective services are there because of parental substance use. And I don't
Yeah.
think it's gotten any better with the COVID and the lockdown, and
Yeah.
many children were isolated with
Yeah.
substance use parents. And
Yeah. That
the,
certainly made things a lot worse.
yeah, and to be honest, with the whole fentanyl crisis, that's caused a lot of children then to lose their parents
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
fentanyl overdoses and problems like that. So then when you talk about the ACEs issue, it's not as simple as these children are affected after they're born by what
Right.
happens in early childhood is that before they're born, their
Yeah.
brains are affected by what happened to them either preconceptionally with the dad
Yeah.
using the alcohol and then
Yeah.
methylated sperm, which we talked about in the last
Yeah.
podcast,
Yeah.
the mother using and then them
And
being affected during the
yeah.
early stages of pregnancy, which is well before most people know they're
Right.
pregnant.
Right. And you mentioned the fentanyl crisis. I just read this week that there is something new coming down the pike that makes fentanyl look like child's play.
And what is it?
Um, I didn't catch the name. It was on the TV news. It comes in pill form, of course, from overseas and being smuggled across our border. But we've already been seeing deaths to it. It's
Well,
supposed to be like more than 10 times as strong as fentanyl.
yeah, and if you think about it, Patty, it is then all of these issues become what's called not just a public health crisis,
Mhm.
but a national security crisis.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
a lot of people can understand, national security better
Yeah,
than understand public health, right? They
yeah,
get
yeah.
about national
And,
security.
you brought that up, and that was actually part of the story. The belief, or the supposition rather, of the channel was that this drug coming from China is used to knock out as many potential future military personnel. So it
Well,
is it is about national security, right?
yeah,
But
and
this is a whole nother side trail.
sidetrack. And I think going back to the issue of foster care, so if
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of the people, and I'm not saying this is that we have a lot of data on this, but many of the children who come from what's traditionally considered broken homes, many of them
Mhm.
do find the military as an option. So when you think about kids going from a situation which might have been like foster care, not necessarily them having been in foster care, but where maybe their family life was chaotic, they might enter the military. And that's kind of another separate issue. But I think that people understanding that even some of the people entering the military have this problem,
Mhm.
really 1 in 15 to 1 in 20. Like
Yeah.
people are saying now, Dr. Phil May, who's done a lot of the studies,
Yeah.
he's saying that even in our general population, it's 1 in 15 to 1 in
Yeah.
20.
Yeah.
Just going to
Yeah.
shut my door.
Yeah, he was saying in September in the National Impact Week in Washington that it's 6.7%,
Wow.
which equals 1 in 15. However, the study he did that stat came from has not been peer reviewed yet.
Mm. Well,
So,
and so having said that, going back to the issue of foster care, it's very hard unless every child who's in foster care gets screened and
mhm,
diagnosed. And to be able
yeah.
to do that, I had a conversation not long ago, probably within the last year and a half, with Dr. Larry Bird out of South Dakota. And he was saying, because he's been doing some work up in one of the counties here in Maryland with their foster care system, that he's been doing mostly just education of the professionals like
Mhm,
had been working in the foster care system, and to teach, everybody from the 0 to 3 staff who work in the county to
mhm,
evaluate young children,
yeah,
to the people in the OBGYN clinics who
yeah,
then would follow the moms before, the baby's delivered, to the pediatricians,
yeah,
to the social workers, to the mental health professionals. So Frederick County has a fairly large contingent of people who now kind of are educated about this. And what he was telling me is you basically have to set up an all-day clinic scenario where you're just going one after another
mhm,
seeing children. And really you'd have to do it every day of the week
Yeah.
to be able to identify all of them. And years ago, because we do know from the maternal histories, and this is what I get into in my book, we do know from the maternal histories the mothers that are using substances, and we shouldn't blame them, but we
Right.
need to be able to identify their child's developmental issues and like understand that it's coming from prenatal alcohol exposure
Yeah.
in my opinion,
Yeah.
because it is a very different phenomenon than say Fragile X or
Mhm.
Down syndrome or um, some of these rare genetic conditions like DeGeorge's, which is
Mhm.
viliofacial syndrome. Like, there are differences in the way the children present. The neurophenotype is different. We're now talking about the neurotype,
Mhm.
which is neurophenotype. And so being able to identify these children is important, but we used to have an FASD clinic here in the state at Kennedy Krieger Institute, run by a mentor of mine, Dr. Paula Lockhart, and they did away with that. So
Mm.
about um, how you can then start to identify this problem separate and apart from others,
Yeah.
which is caused by our social drug of choice.
Yeah.
We're going to have politicians, policymakers, legislators. We're going to have the people at the top tier of the government departments, like Department of
Yeah.
Education, like Child and Family Services, Health and Human Services. We're
Mhm.
going to have people in the states who are committed to this. And
Yeah.
so far in our state, we don't have that.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I went to meet with the guy who's head of what should be the FASD. We don't have a task force, but he's really, it's a geneticist who is in the State Department of Maternal and Child Health. And he didn't even know that was part of his, underlying mission or responsibility until I went with one of my interns and met with him. But anyway, so then you would have to have, people who are funding doing this,
Yeah. Yeah.
evaluating children and getting them connected with the community services. And unfortunately, if you think about it, and I knew about this all the way back when I did my Master of Public Health and way before I even wrote my book, there aren't enough, say, child psychiatrists anyway.
Mhm.
There's 8,000 in the whole country.
Is
And then
that all?
there's only 8,000 of us, okay? In the whole,
Wow.
and at the time I trained, it was like maybe 7,000.
Yeah.
So I think there's about 8,000 now, but having
Yeah.
said that, and a lot of people do retire, as you know,
Mhm.
and you have to then have funding to to have the people going into the
Yeah.
positions.
Yeah.
So having said that, the developmental pediatricians they're another group that would see these kids, but
Mhm.
oftentimes they
And
don't.
they're also few and far between.
They are, and yet they are trained to be able to identify their
Mhm.
unique needs and to refer them to
Yeah.
the community services at a young age because they're
Mhm.
pediatricians. And then pediatricians in general would be able to identify it, but not enough of them are trained on
Right.
this issue. And to be quite frank, a lot of the departments of genetics and developmental pediatrics that train these individuals do not even believe that ND-PAE or fetal alcohol syndrome is separate and apart from, they're still back
Mhm.
in 73 and before 1973 when the
Yeah.
seminal came out. Even though American Academy of Pediatrics has it, a whole training module on their website, and they say they put out, informational sessions for their pediatricians, but there are so many other competing issues.
Mhm.
And then you throw
Yeah.
in the vaccinations, COVID,
Yeah.
all of these RSV,
Mm.
these
Yeah. And I
problems.
I made that point when I was talking with Dr. Jones, a few months back, that, it's so frustrating to me, first with type 1 diabetes that it's so rare to find a doctor that understands the difference between type 1 and type 2, right? Because type 1 is only 5 to 10%. But they're completely different diseases, even though a lot of the symptoms present the same. And then also with FASD, it just is flabbergasting that, did I make that up? That there should still be this level of ignorance, right? Or lack of learning on this topic today in 2024. It just blows my mind. And yet I have to appreciate how much there is to learn in medical school. And even though medical school is like the longest educational program you can go through compared to what you need to know, you know, where do you find the time to teach on everything, or to learn everything that you need to be competent in,
Well, and to be quite frank, we never, finished learning, excuse me, in
right?
med taught that we are professional students, we're lifelong
Yes.
learners, and it's practice that
Yeah.
we do. When you say medical practice, it does
Yeah.
mean that you finish learning. So we
Yeah.
have to do 50 credits here in the state of Maryland
Yeah.
every 2 years. We have to have 50
Yeah.
hours worth of continuing education training. So I
Yeah.
went to our state medical association, which is MedCai. It was the very first state medical association established in the country. It's the Maryland Medical Society, to ask, would they be willing to support a bill to have all physicians in the state of Maryland have training on this, just 2
Hmm.
hours. We've had to have mandatory opioid training, even if we
Hmm.
don't prescribe opioids. We've had to have mandatory ethics training,
Yeah.
which I see how that can benefit. But if this is the number of children
Yeah.
that we know are out there who grow up to be adults with
Yeah.
400 different non-communicable disorders,
Hmm.
then we need that training. Now, having said that, if we go back to foster care, um, the problem there is that the muddy waters start to complicate the situation with
Yeah.
ACEs. And
Yeah.
so it's great that we now know, and psychiatrists have known this, all the way back to, the psychoanalysts. That's why psychoanalysis came to be, so that you could unravel
Hmm.
what happened from your early childhood, adverse childhood experiences,
Yeah.
and be able to work through that. And most people don't realize that's what analysis is
Hmm.
about,
Hmm.
to be able to better interpret and to have in the conscious mind these traumas that had
Right.
happened. But psychiatrists are more smoke and mirrors kind of people, and psychiatrists generally have been trained, at least back in the day, not to look at things like we're going to tell people exactly what their problems are. Okay, so
Hmm.
a long time psychiatrists weren't even telling the people their diagnosis, as an example.
Yeah.
um, and the modern psychiatry has become biologically oriented
Hmm.
with medication, largely
Yeah.
medication driven, but they don't, again, tell anybody about etiology
Hmm.
being how
The
this,
cause.
the
Yeah.
causes. Now
Yeah.
that the causes are getting out in the open, like ACEs, trauma, the adverse childhood experiences, it's muddying the waters to where these kids in foster care, people are being told, who adopt them or have them in their homes, it's because of trauma.
Yeah.
Okay, when in fact a lot of kids have trauma that have solid neurodevelopmental,
Hmm.
um you know they're
Yeah.
typical
Yeah.
neurodevelopmentally, and
Yeah.
they can better process the trauma and
Right.
work with in therapy or with the supports of the community,
Yeah.
maybe their grandparents or their loved ones or teachers, people like that. So when you look at the problem when the children have neurodevelopmental conditions like ND-PAE slash FASD,
Hmm.
FASD, the umbrella term, not a diagnostic term,
Right. Right.
ND-PAE and fetal alcohol syndrome being the diagnostic terms, and partial fetal alcohol syndrome. When you get a child born with these brain wiring
Mhm.
problem that then has the experience of ACEs, or even in the womb,
Yeah.
the mother was abused and,
Right.
you know, like
Yeah.
the
All the cortisol flowing through
right,
and yeah.
cortisol and other neuroendocrine modulators that then are acting on the already miswired brain, and the
Mhm.
mother continuing to drink to deal with her
Yeah.
aggressor in
Yeah.
the home, or her boyfriend that's occasionally
Yeah.
visiting, beating her up. Um, then the child being born, and the community looking at this
Yeah.
woman like she's a pariah, and
Mm.
wondering why she can't care for her own child.
Yeah.
Like, why is she like confusing her
Yeah.
baby? Like, I remember back in the day reading articles about how this mother would accidentally put her baby in the microwave instead of the baby bottle. And then she woke up the next morning on the couch and with the baby laying next to her dead, and started screaming, "What, who killed my baby? Who killed my baby?" And
Mm.
come to find out she had put the baby in the microwave.
Yeah.
Okay. In the blacked out state, did not
Yeah.
realize what he was doing. So having said that, I know that the foster care situation is a big one. And I think that the traditional way of handling these children before foster care was they went into orphanages,
Mhm.
and they went into institutions. Some of them did get adopted. That's back in like the 50s and 60s. But a lot of the babies, if they were considered unadoptable, would then
Mhm.
go, and if they were irritable, if they were, screaming, if they were crying, if they couldn't figure out what their issues were, or maybe they were born with a cleft lip or palate, or some other minor birth defect, which is very common with prenatal alcohol exposure,
Mhm.
it would be seen as unadoptable and then put in these orphanages. Well, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, people decided, hey, this isn't workable.
Yeah.
Let's foster care. But the foster care system is not a highly funded system.
Right.
And these families who are out of the goodness of their heart, many of them Christian or Jewish or Catholic, they're very well-meaning people who may, for their own reasons, want to have a child, can't have a child,
Mhm.
or have already had children, want to adopt children, want to, give more love. They have a
Yeah.
lot of love to give. They bring the children into their home, and they figure out that it is not going to work with this
Yeah.
child in their home, because they get
Yeah.
traumatized by the child's underlying
Right.
neurodevelopmental issues that are
Right.
impacted by the trauma.
Right. And
Um,
I think there's several factors contributing to that. If we sidestep for a moment to the people working within social services, they're not trained in this either. So, what model drives their approach is learning theory, which basically says, and this is oversimplified, that all behavior is chosen, right? And so, behavior modification becomes the way that you improve the kids and make them more suitable for permanency. But when the underlying issue is neurological, there's no kind of bribe or punishment, no incentive or consequence that's going to undo that neurological damage that was done from the alcohol.
well, so going back to what you just said, which the childcare workers not being adequately trained in this topic, the Center for Adoption Support and Education here in Maryland, which has a few different sites, I think one
Case is wonderful.
about case. So
Yeah.
they, I was on a 5-year initiative that they had. I think they got like $9 million. I didn't get paid a dime of that money, but I did sit on their national training initiative.
Yeah.
Uh, for
I've done both of those for social workers.
Okay, so their
Yeah.
training, you've done the training that we produced,
Yeah.
right? So the training that they produced was to train mental health workers
Yeah.
in adoption competency.
Right.
Okay, so or yes, that is right. So to train social workers, mental health workers,
Mm-hmm.
psychiatrists, all the like in adoption competency.
Yeah.
And part of that was teaching them kind of trauma informed.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with that training, I for that whole 5 years sat there saying, look, you guys are missing the point. Many of these children, which you're saying 70%, I'm not saying it's higher than that. I think that the data are lacking. I think
Yeah.
that the study done by Ira Chasnoff showed that it's misdiagnosed, and
Mm-hmm.
so it's meaning they diagnosed something else instead of
Right.
it's misdiagnosed, and the diagnosis is missed. So
Right.
he
Right.
on this, and he showed that of the
Yeah.
children that he interviewed and diagnosed, it was something like 25% were either misdiagnosed or missed
I thought
diagnosed.
it was 86.
No, you have to look at the data.
Okay.
86% isn't that they had FASD. It may have been 86% of the children. This is how it went. It was like 25% of the children he looked at had the diagnosis itself.
Mm-hmm.
And of those 80%, 86% of the children,
Had previously been misdiagnosed.
yes,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's 25% of the children he looked at coming into the clinic
Yeah.
had this as a diagnosis. Now, I happen to think that's a very low number
Mm-hmm.
compared to what the figures are, but and you said 70%. I don't know where that came from, but I'm not saying that's not
Yeah.
true. I think,
I found that when I was doing the research for my book.
yeah.
I just can't think of the source authors off the top of my head.
So let's say it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 25%, which I think is what Chasnoff showed, to say 70%, whatever it is, whatever number. And the problem even with those numbers is that most clinicians, most physicians, if you, and I'm not saying nurse practitioners, PAs, I
Mhm.
think they only have 2 years of education on top of their
Yeah.
undergrad. So it's no better than a social worker. And no offense, but I've had 28 years of education,
Yeah.
including, first through 12th grade, which I
Yeah.
didn't learn in preschool. So having said that, I'm not saying that any of these other people can't make a diagnosis. It's just that even the people that are highest qualified to make the diagnosis are missing it.
Yeah.
And most would say, well, I didn't see the mother sitting on the bar stool. She wasn't sitting on the bar stool next to me. So how do I know she was drinking?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And what I say is, first of all, there are many of these children that have partial fetal alcohol
Mhm.
or full fetal alcohol that aren't being diagnosed.
Yeah.
The second thing is, many of these children, if you ask about the birth dad's use, this is
Mhm.
pink elephant in the room.
Yeah.
That birth dad, he may have alcohol methylation effects on his sperm DNA, and
Mhm.
nobody's asking.
Yeah.
Well, that figure is 75% of those that the researchers are calling FASD, 75%. And this is from animal data because we
Mhm.
can't, there's no way
Yeah.
to dose men, human
Yeah.
men, but done it in animals and shown that 75% of what we would call fetal alcohol spectrum disorder
Mhm.
is due to male sperm methylation effects.
Yeah.
Okay. And if we know that, then it's not enough to blame the mother. So
Right.
I'm saying don't blame the mother. I'm
Right.
saying blame the industry that's
Yeah.
causing this, and let's start doing the studies that
Yeah.
are needed and the clinical, getting these kids who have already been identified
Yeah.
by the system. I didn't make up the system,
Yeah.
but decided they're going to put these children into well-intentioned homes. So before you put them into the well-intentioned homes with loving, caregiving,
Yeah.
parents, let's go ahead and get
Yeah.
them, make it mandatory that they get screened for this. How about you
Yeah.
start with that? Okay.
So have you seen the study that Kenneth Jones is one of the authors of, I think just maybe 2 years ago? It was small, and I think that's why it's not more widely known and talked about. It needs to be replicated with a larger number
Right.
of subjects. But what he found, he and those he was partnered with, what they found is that you can get away from the need for the mother to confirm alcohol use by analyzing the kid's baby teeth, that
Mm,
they respond in a particular fashion to a particular chemical. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, we need to have every once this can be substantiated as a verifiable, yes, this is effective, we need to have all the pediatric dentists in the country trained so that it can be universal screening. Anyone who takes their kid to a dentist, bring a baby tooth. Once you have a tooth falling out, bring it.
let me just tell you our big government problem with that. Okay. And
Yeah.
that is, if we start identifying the children, then what?
Then
Do
we
you,
have to pay for support.
hang on, Patty, hang on. Then you're going to have to blame these socialites
Mhm.
who are the senators and the congressmen's wives. I'm sorry to tell you that, who have been out to the same cocktail parties their husbands have been at
Mhm.
and inadvertently used, and then the baby teeth of their children come up positive. Yes, because baby teeth are something that develop into from buds up in the
Yeah.
gum, and that's why they're able to identify this. Now, it
Yeah.
turns out that it's not going to pick up children who were exposed before the baby teeth ever became buds.
Mhm.
Okay, it's not going to, and yes, all of these things, but you can't do just one
Yeah.
way of testing it. It's
Yeah.
not like what you brought up before, Patty, the diabetes, because we don't have a litmus test. And
Mhm.
yes, they're looking for this. They're saying,
Yeah.
okay, we can identify stuff in the baby teeth. But the problem, with any of these tests is you have to go further and further
Yeah.
back than that, because this begins as far as the female at late third, early fourth week post
Yeah.
conception, when the major malformations associated
Mhm.
with Alcohol syndrome happen.
Right.
That's with the face forming.
Yeah.
And the problem then with that is most women don't know they're pregnant. So you can't
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
blame a woman. And so putting on the label, I put it back to big alcohol.
Yeah.
Label is inadequate.
Yeah.
And that these kids who are ending up in foster care, we're deciding to
Mhm.
take those babies away from their birth moms,
Yeah.
but we're not deciding to take all babies that are prenatally exposed away.
Yeah.
Just
And one of the things from working in social services for as long as I have, one of the things that I hear a lot is from, and I've always worked in the nonprofit sphere, right? The county contracts with the companies that I have worked for the day-to-day oversight of the kids. Um, but the county social workers, one thing I so often hear are complaints about, why isn't this mom getting it? We're not asking anything that's too difficult. But here's my thing. We know that alcohol use is so very often intergenerational. Well, wouldn't it stand to reason then that so are the effects? So not only is this child that we're working with presently exposed, but in all likelihood, so was the mom, who also has neurological effects from what her mother has done during pregnancy without knowing any better. And therefore, because there's that neurological rewiring, in the mom, it's a simple case plan is not so simple.
Well, and so Patty, this is what rubs me the wrong way. I know a lot of the research that's out there dating back to like the early 70s when they began this, and even way before that, leading up to prohibition. And that's a lot of what I reveal in my book.
Mm.
But Dr. Ann Strythguth showed exactly what you're saying
Mhm.
way back in the 80s, 70s,
Mhm.
and 80s, that the birth moms themselves, many of them, what these ones that are getting their babies taken away have fetal alcohol themselves.
Yeah.
They have some degree of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder.
Yeah.
And why they're not getting it is that they don't have the neurocognitive faculty
Exactly.
to get that type of understanding.
Yeah.
And what we did in North Carolina is we developed a program called Grace Court. And what we did is we asked the question of women in the halfway house that it was a NIDA funded halfway house. We asked the women, why do you keep coming back every 2 years with another
Mm.
substance exposed pregnancy?
Yeah.
We asked them. And, you know, the program called Our House, which was the halfway house, they would live in until the baby's first birthday. So they might have lived there for up to say 18 months because
Mhm.
on average they were getting in at 5 to 6 months pregnant. The baby had for 5 to 6 months. Then they got into the halfway house. So people assumed when the babies were born that, oh, they're fine because mom stopped using. But remember, the babies had been exposed for the first 5 to 6 months.
Yeah.
My daughter to put my dogs away, and that's what happens when you have a child in college.
Yeah.
They go off to school and don't get the
Yeah.
anyway.
I,
So
I see a tail flicking behind you.
that's Sparky.
Yeah.
Anyway, Sparky and Daisy. So we had asked these women, you know, because we found that a majority of the women were what in social work and in mental health they sometimes call frequent flyers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a crass term. I do not like it. But we found that, you know, these women who had lived in our house for, you know, sometimes 18 months until their child's first birthday, and then they were placed back in the community with whatever social services, you know, substance use supports that were offered them. They would come back in 2 years with another substance exposed pregnancy without their baby that they had held right for that time. And we would ask, you know, I was hired by Robinson Healthcare Corporation to do, you know, figure this problem out. This is one of the that I had to figure out. And we did a series of focus groups with the women, the mental health workers, the county social services, with all of these different players. And the big question that I asked, why do you keep coming back every 2 years?
Mm-hmm.
Where is your baby? Why are you pregnant again? And they would say, the women would say, well, the government keeps taking my babies away from me.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So in their mind, they wanted to have a child.
Yeah.
They felt like they couldn't do it. So then digging deeper, well, what happened? Well, they would go back to the neighborhood, living couch homeless with family members because
Mm-hmm.
they have enough money to have their own place. Even, you know, affordable housing in rural North Carolina, where the program was, Robinson County, very hard to find.
Yeah.
Thing. And even in, let's say, the government housing apartment complexes, a lot of those have many different substances flowing freely.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so they would go back to live with a family member. They would go from one couch to the next couch to the next couch, next couch. As soon as somebody got tired of hearing their baby screaming and
They'd have to move.
baby and all of this. And so, and okay, we're going to do something about this. And Jenny Lau, a very prominent, she was prominent in the Public Health Association, National Public Health Association. She's Lumbee herself. She she envisioned, after learning these women's plight, she envisioned this transitional housing community for women in recovery and their children. So we set about to hire a housing consultant, special needs housing consultant. I wrote a grant for a $300,000 grant to HUD special needs homeless housing for these women who were couch homeless. They were being moved around. And we developed and built over a 2-year period. And it was amazing how the county came together, the mayor, all of the different parts of the social service system, the public and private system, North Carolina Housing Finance Agency. And it's a 24-unit transitional housing facility where the women can live for 2 years. It's gated. There's no males allowed in or out. The woman has to sign that she'll be working or in school, part of her Section 8 rental assistance. She's able to be reunited with her children, sometimes 4 or 5 children, all under the age of 12 from foster care. They reunited, they live there together with their moms. They are transported to and from school, to and from work. There's an on-site community building that we built with that $300,000 grant. It was a $1.8 million project altogether, but the community building where the women, it's embedded right there in the gated community, receive all their social services. So everything from, substance abuse treatment, mental health, everything. And these women had never even, many of them, had their own anything like pocketbook, plus their own apartment. And so grateful that they were moving into, it opened February of 98, but moving into their brand new 4 or 5 bedroom apartment because they had a lot of children. And the program has done so well in North Carolina. They've replicated it 8 times. There's 8 of these in North Carolina now.
Nice.
And one of the women who graduated was one of the very first graduates of the program, is now running Grace Court herself. So that's how this works. It's not to keep taking the babies away from the birth home. We need to strengthen kinship care, Patti. My mom died not from alcohol-related problems, but from postpartum depression when I was 3 months old. And I was raised by my grandparents. Grandmother had a 6th grade education. And she taught me there is nothing I can't do if I put my mind to it and keep getting my education. Kinship care works. Okay. My brother, sister, and I, we all graduated high school. None of us ended up with problems. And it worked for our family. It worked for other families if we put more money into helping families rather than taking these babies and putting the system that you yourself said was broken.
Well, and it's a lack of training, and a lot of kin care providers don't get any training either on the specific issues that their young family members have. My big thing with foster care is they're slow to bring in some of these facts. For example, it's very commonly taught in pre-certification training or pre-license training that about dysmaturity. They don't call it that. They just tell the prospective foster parents, the children we give you are going to be half of their chronological age developmentally. And then they just put that fact out there and move on to something else. They never tell anyone, well, what do you do with that information? You know, they never say support them through a situation as if they were that younger age. Give them the assistance you would to a child of that younger age and help them, you know, scaffold their growth, scaffold their skills so that they can achieve successes. They don't ever share that. You know, so it's like, okay, so I know my child's immature because they don't provide the correct terminology of dysmaturity, you know, but and you know, most people, you know, with immaturity, you can snap out of it and act your age. But with dysmaturity, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And without that basic awareness, caregivers, whether they're birth parents, foster parents, kin care parents, are left frustrated, you know, and thinking in that old school way of my child is a problem instead of my child has a neurological problem.
And you know, I see a number of kids in kinship care, as well as kids who have been adopted from foster care in my
Mhm,
private practice. And I work with parents all the time on these
mhm,
issues, the grandparents, the, adoptive parents.
mm,
And generally, I think that people, once they're given this information, it does help.
yeah,
Uh, in my own case, I didn't have any of those neurodevelopmental issues, which is why I ended up writing my book, because
mhm,
I thought to myself, there go I, but for the grace of God. Like, it's
yeah,
why this issue so compelled me is,
yeah,
well, I had a healthy womb
mhm,
for those 9 months because my mother was a teetotaler. She and
yeah,
my too, we grew up in the Bible Belt, and people just didn't, you know, they didn't really use alcohol. But I thought to myself, I didn't have my birth mom, but I had a good brain. I started out with a good brain, and I had good mothering from my
yeah,
grandma who had a
yeah,
sick patient. And
yeah,
so I thought, well, what would have been like for me, had I had this experience in the
yeah,
womb? And I, for whatever reasons, I was very interested in development. I was very
mhm,
interested um, you know, giving back.
yeah,
I have since I was 10 years old that I really want, I was here on the planet for a reason. I think we
mhm,
all are. And this
mhm,
really, really
yeah,
spawned, it spurred me on,
yeah,
and I've continued to do it. But foster care in our country is broken.
yeah,
And unless and until we start addressing the basic needs of these families and these children,
yeah,
even a colleague and now friend of mine, Rob Shear, was in foster care from age 12 because his parents died. And he was given a trash bag
mhm,
to take his clothing into the first foster home and subsequent foster homes. And when he and his husband adopted their first set of 4 children, they all 4 came with trash bags. And he looked
mhm,
at those trash bags and he goes, "You mean the system hasn't changed in 40 years?"
yeah,
And so he went back and developed a nonprofit called Comfort Cases. Okay. And he provides they're co-founders of Comfort Cases. And you can find them on comfortcases.org. I'm not trying to promote them, but
why
they
not?
yeah, they actually provide a pair of pajamas, brand new pajamas, toothbrush, soap, and a teddy bear or a little stuffy, and a comfortable blanket
Mhm,
for all children who need it, who are going
yeah,
from into a foster care
yeah,
situation. And the social workers around the country can call Comfort Cases or go on their website
yeah,
and get that for the child. And why that's helpful is it shows the child that they are worth something.
yes, yeah,
And but going back to your point about the women, we need to do a better job getting the
mhm,
women out of these very difficult
yeah,
situations. And
yeah,
should they choose to raise their own children, even if they have neurodevelopmental issues
yeah,
themselves,
yeah,
need the support to
yes,
their own children. And then like we did at Grace Court, you get them
Mm-hmm.
with family planning
Yeah.
and conception help, and you give them the education and the means
Yeah.
to get birth control. And let me tell
Yeah.
you, in rural areas, these women were living 30, 40 miles away from the nearest public
Mm-hmm.
clinic where they could get
Yeah.
access to control.
Yeah.
So we're going to have more of these
Yeah.
public health initiatives go hand in hand with the mental
Yeah.
health,
Yeah. Absolutely, they do.
the foster care problem.
Yeah. I really do appreciate Grace Court as an alternative model, right? And to be fair for all those working in traditional foster care, um, I just want to say that everyone has the best of intentions. None of us know what we didn't know until we finally learned it. And that's part of what spurs me on. That's why one of the things that I offer is professional development training, because we cannot meet the needs until we're able to identify them. And if by continuing to just use our judgment and shame kids for their choices and shame parents for their choices without recognizing that they're brain-based issues, we're going to miss the mark, and the system is going to continue to be broken.
Yeah. Well,
So,
I'm so grateful to you, Patti, for all that you're doing and your book, Sip by Sip. As I told you, I just heard a young man who I had worked with for years and who's now in jail. And his mom reached out to me and asked, are there any books that he could
mhm.
read to help him understand
Yeah,
his condition, ND-PAE,
yeah,
FASD. I referred him to your book. And I really wish that I know that you felt this way too. I feel this way. If everyone could just realize this, if they
mhm.
can read about it. I know you're working to get
Yeah,
yours an Audible book. I'm
yeah.
very much interested in that as well. And
I'll
I,
hook you up.
partnering with one another, I just
Yeah.
love this. I love the
Yeah.
idea of it's interesting. You were raised by your birth mom, but you
Mhm.
were daily exposed
Yeah.
and you're now caring for your birth mom
Yeah.
in her elderly years with
Yeah.
dementia. For me, I was not prenatally exposed, but I
Mhm.
lost my birth mom at 3 months old.
Yeah.
And so like we're living like almost two different like mirror image
Yeah. Yeah.
situations.
Yeah. And still we partner well together.
I believe so.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So we're like we've gone probably more than our hour. But this has been a fabulous conversation. And I can't believe that everything's wrapped up so quickly. I mean, the hour's just flown by. Great, great conversation, Susan. I think together we've put so many important pieces out there. And I think this episode really needs to be promoted to service providers, no matter what their field, as well as families, because parents are their kids' best advocates, right? And for those in my audience who, like myself, are adults living with FASD, then we have our own advocacy roles to fill, and we can use also this information to keep us spurred on to continue the good work. Um, Everyone, I want to thank you for tuning in this week to this wonderful episode with Dr. Susan Rich, a child psychiatrist from Maryland, who's graciously come on again a third time. um, I hope you have a wonderful week. I hope that this information has really sparked some interest in you and given you some ideas on things that you can do to move the needle forward as we all work together to make a meaningful change in our society. If you want to join the group over on Facebook, oh, my dogs are playing. Another sign it's time to wrap things up and get them some breakfast. Um, yeah, totally sidetracked me, but that's okay because we're out of time.
Great talking to you,
But
Pat. I look
yeah,
forward to us connecting again soon.
Okay, that sounds really good. Everyone have a fantastic week. Be blessed. And don't forget to come on back next Monday for another episode of Living with FASD. Bye for now.